This is Mr. Ben with another edition of Know Your History. Today I wanted to tell you about the story of a rescue. And it involves this man, General Lewis Henry Carpenter. Now, Carpenter was a captain at the time of the rescue that I'm going to tell you about. He had served in the Civil War and was serving out west during the Indian Wars. And he was leading a troop of soldiers, Company H, in the 10th U.S. Cavalry. Now, the 10th Cavalry is more famously known, along with its sister regiment, the 9th Cavalry, as the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, they were an all-black regiment with white officers. And Captain Carpenter was one of those officers. Now, they were stationed at Fort Wallace at the time of the rescue, which was September 1868, on the plains of Kansas. They were protecting the railroad workers of the Kansas and Pacific Railroad, which was then encroaching upon Indian hunting grounds of the Sioux, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne nations. Now, one of Carpenter's friends from the war was a man by the name of George Alexander Forsyth, also known as Sandy. And there's a picture of Sandy Forsyth. Carpenter and Forsyth had served together under General Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. They were both members of his staff, so they were well acquainted with each other. Now, Forsyth had put together a command of 50 frontier scouts, and the idea was that it would be a rapid striking force to follow after and attack the Indians after their raids. The Indians would come and attack the working parties, or they would attack settlers' homes, and they needed a mobile force that was well armed. These scouts were equipped with 7-shot Spencer repeating rifles and Colt 6-shooters. They were well armed and they had plenty of ammunition. And they began to follow the Indian Trail in September, and the trail began to grow wider. And suddenly it was a case of the hunters becoming the hunted. One of Forsyth's scouts suggested that they had come upon seeing all the signs and the tracks, they had come upon a very large Indian war party, and that perhaps discretion was the better part of valor. Now, Sandy Forsyth, Major Forsyth, with speaking out of more bravado than brains, said, "Well, you signed up to fight Indians, didn't you?" And so they kept pursuing this ever-widening trail of the Indians of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. Now, they made camp on a branch of called the Arickaree, a branch of the Republican River, and this is in eastern Colorado territory. And as they made camp, they saw signs that night. There was fires and signal, kind of like arrows being shot in the air, lighted arrows, and it was apparent that attack was imminent. Now, the attack came on the morning of September 17th, 1868. It was estimated between 500 and 600 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors attacked Forsyth's party of 50 scouts. Now, the men scampered onto an island, really a sandbar, about 100 yards long and 40 yards wide, in the Arickaree fork of the Republican River. There wasn't much water in the river. It was really just a foot or two of water in the dry season. And the men began to dig rifle pits, and their horses were all shot down, and the Indians circled the men and tried to overrun their position. And here's a picture of how that looked with a furious Indian charge. Quickly, Major Forsyth was wounded in both legs, shot in both legs, and his lieutenant, Beecher, for whom the island would be named, this would be later called the Battle of Beechers Island. Lieutenant Beecher was killed, and so was the surgeon, so there was nobody to tend to the wounded. Another one of the wounded was a man by the name of Harrington, Frank Harrington, who happened to be shot with an arrow directly into his forehead. Now, Harrington, being a tough customer, tried to remove the arrow calmly, but the shaft broke off, leaving the arrowhead embedded in his skull. Now, an Indian bullet soon after struck the exact same place where the arrowhead was, knocking out the arrowhead, and Harrington bandaged up his wound and continued to fight. Now, that's a case of truth being stranger than fiction. He would survive the battle. But someone who did not survive was one of the Indian leaders. His name was Roman Nose, and he wasn't a chief, but he was a very powerful warrior. But he had a problem. On this particular day, he had his war bonnet, which he considered magical, and that it protected him from the white man's bullets. Unfortunately, he had been served a piece of bread that had been taken out of the fire with a pair of iron tongs. Now, that was taboo, the iron tongs, so his magic was spoiled, and he was certain that he would be killed if he went into the battle. So, and he had to wait to go through an elaborate purification ritual in order to have that protection again. But some of his fellow warriors chided him for this because of the firepower of the scouts with those 7-shot repeating rifles was holding off the Indians, keeping them from overrunning Forsyth's men. So he was goaded into leading the charge, and sure enough, Roman Nose was killed leading a charge. Now, after that, there was no more Indian attacks, but they kind of laid siege. They surrounded the scouts and began to, and they kept firing into the camp, but the soldiers were well dug in. By nightfall, Forsyth asked for volunteers, 2 men, to try to get through the Indians surrounding their position and try to get back to Fort Wallace to get help. Now, all the horses have been shot. Horses and mules have been killed, so they had to go on foot, and it's about 100 miles back to Fort Wallace. So they left at night, 2 men, Pierre Trudeau and Jack Stillwell. And as they were crawling past the Indians, trying not to be discovered, because they knew had they been captured, they would suffer a terrible fate, they came, they were crawling past the Indians when a rattlesnake crawled out and threatened to strike them. Now, Jack Stillwell happened to be chewing some tobacco. He had a large trawl of tobacco in his jaw, and he spat out a stream of tobacco juice into the face of the rattler, which was startled and then slithered away. Now, kids, don't you try that at home. Eventually, Jack Stillwell and Pierre Trudeau made it to Fort Wallace, and just as they were approaching the fort, two troopers from Captain Carpenter's Company H were riding out of the fort. Stillwell gave the trooper a crude map that Forsyth had drawn, and they went to find Captain Carpenter, who happened to be 45 miles away from Fort Wallace at Sand Creek on a scout. So they had to backtrack and then go northwesterly direction to try to find Major Forsyth and his besieged command. And here is Captain Carpenter riding out with H Company of the 10th Cavalry, looking for Major Forsyth and the 50 scouts. Now, as they were approaching, finding their way, Captain Carpenter realized that with the wagons, he took 13 wagons with supplies, medical supplies, and food, because the scouts were out of food at this point. and he knew that they would be running out. And they also brought an ambulance and the surgeon from the fort. Because the wagons were slowing them down, Captain Carpenter took 30 troopers, and went ahead as rapidly as possible. And as they were approaching Beechers Island, they came across an Indian camp which had been abandoned recently, and they found Carpenter counted 13 scaffolds. The Indians were buried in this way. The Cheyenne would put their dead warriors on a scaffold. They would be so much closer to heaven that way. And they would take a war pony, a favorite war pony. They would kill the pony, and because the warrior would need his pony and his weapons when he was on the happy hunting ground in the next life. So Captain Carpenter counted 13 of these bodies. They took one down and examined the body. They were very respectful. They didn't disturb anything, but they examined the body and saw that the warrior had been killed by a gunshot. So they assumed these were recent casualties of the battle at Beechers Island. Well, as they approached, some of the scouts the Indians had left. This was 9 days after the battle on September 17th. And as they approached, some of the men saw figures riding off in the distance, and they assumed it was the Indians coming back for another attack. But as they got closer, they realized it was Captain Carpenter and his men of the 10th Cavalry. Forsyth recognized Carpenter, his gait on the horse, how he would ride his horse, and he didn't want to lose his composure. Now remember, he'd been wounded in both legs, and blood poisoning had set in, and he was in bad shape, hovering in and out of consciousness. So he found a copy in his saddlebag of a dog-eared copy of Oliver Twist, and pretended to be reading as Carpenter rode up and dismounted to shake his hand. And he kind of said at that moment, what took you so long? Or another account says that he told Carpenter, he said, "Welcome to Beechers Island." And there's Reuben Waller, Carpenter's orderly, holding the horse, and Carpenter shaking hands with the wounded Major Forsyth, his old friend. Now the the campsite was horrible because the horses had been killed, and they were rotting. The men had been eating the putrid horse flesh as their only sustenance until Carpenter arrived, and his men and the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry were giving their rations to the scouts, the surviving scouts. There had been 6 killed and 15 wounded, almost half of Forsyth's command. In fact, the surgeon had to tell them to stop giving their rations because having, bacon and hardtack isn't a good thing to eat after you've been starving for over a week. So Carpenter had brought with the wagons tents and medical supplies, and they took Forsyth and the wounded and put them in tents, and so that they would get well enough to recover their strength. Now, the surgeon wanted to amputate Forsyth's leg, but he refused, but he did survive with his leg, but it was touch and go there for a while. Now, for this action, Carpenter's rescue of Forsyth, and for another battle that he fought 3 weeks later on the Beaver Creek battle, he was awarded for these actions the Congressional Medal of Honor, which the Civil War or late Indian War version, something like that. And the citation reads, Carpenter was gallant and meritorious throughout the campaigns, especially in the combat of October 15th, and in the forced march on September 23rd, 24th, and 25th to the relief of Forsyth's scouts, who were known to be in danger of annihilation by largely superior forces of Indians. Now, Carpenter went on to have a distinguished career on the frontier. He also served in the Spanish-American War, and he retired as a brigadier general in 1899. And he lived in Philadelphia, and he lectured and wrote about his experiences. And when he died, he was buried in the family plot at Trinity Church in Swedesboro. And this is a photo of Carpenter's grave. And you can go there and visit it today. He's not far from another general we had talked about before, General Harker, who had been killed in the Civil War. I think it's pretty remarkable that a little cemetery in a little town of Swedesboro has two generals in between the governor of New Jersey buried in one quiet cemetery. So that's all I have to tell you today. I hope you'll join me next time for Know Your History. And as always, happy trails.